Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, parents of all ages, I couldn't be more excited than to bring you my next guest. Emily Wilson has been a BCBA since 2016 and has worked with autistic individuals and others using the principles of ABA since about 2012, I believe. Her first big job in the field is with our last guest, Dr. Megan Miller, back when Megan was just a lowly master's level BCBA like us. In 2018, Emily left navigational behavior consulting and set up her own shop with a mentor from NBC. In 2019, she founded the Tidewater Behavior and Analysts Collaborative and is their current chair. In addition to board certification as a BA, Emily is also a certified clinical trauma specialist. She mentions Megan Miller and Lori Stacy as her influences on her career, as well as her current business partner, Katie Fitterer, among others. If you didn't have a chance to, be sure to check out that previous episode where I got to sit down and talk with Dr. Megan Miller. Definitely go back and find it. Megan was an amazing guest and has done so much for the field. And I'd like to point out that she often has had to do that while swimming upstream against the status quo opposition. So Emily, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
I just wanted to ask, I'm curious, because you've also been someone on the forefront of fighting for a more compassionate ABA, have you run into any pushback from others in the field? And do you think your work as a trauma specialist has helped to color your current approach to ABA for children with ASD?
I have hired both folks with experience in ABA and folks without experience in ABA. And what I've noticed is that while ABA certainly has our specific field specific problems that we need to face head on, that there is a cultural way that we regard children, disabled or otherwise, that does not emphasize their autonomy, that regards children as entities to be controlled by adults. And while, of course, I recognize that there are safety concerns and that children do need guidance, they're not born with the knowledge that they need to be functioning adults, of course. I do notice that there is not a ton of difference in the learning curve between folks who have been in the field for a while when I train them on ascent-based therapeutic practices and folks who are brand new to this and should reasonably be blank slates comparatively. So that's one interesting thing that I think about when we're talking about like pushback. And then of course there's the more classic pushback of kind of the old school folks who are not ready to take a progressive approach to providing services. And I think that is kind of part and parcel of any evolutionary process.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was focused on in the question is, have you had to deal with some of that?
Certainly, yeah. I think, I present on ascent-based interventions pretty frequently, and there's always, doubters who have kind of come to that webinar or workshop or whatever, seemingly to, debunk my assertions that ascent should be an important component of your programming as a analyst and an implementer.
Well, I've definitely seen and been a part of some of your presentations, so I know you can handle it. So let's just backtrack a little bit. I think most behavior analysts can point back to an aha type of a moment when the principles of behavior just kind of bonked them on the head and said, well, I guess we're going to be friends now. Did you have a moment like that where you just knew that ABA in some form was the path that you needed to be on and taking as a teacher and a clinician?
I think more so than a moment, that the science of behavior. So I was raised by a college professor and a career counselor. So this kind of worldview that I grew up with really vibes with a science of learning, right? Like this, it just makes sense to me. My undergraduate degree is in sociology, and I minored in religion. And I really like the study of people and making sense of us, right? I'm just kind of naturally drawn to that. And this science really vibes with how I see the world as a lot of environmental influences kind of pushing people in one way or another.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks. So let me ask you, when you first received your training in ABA, were there any techniques or recommendations that left you a bit concerned, or things that just didn't sit right with you?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say that there were a lot of things that at the time it didn't red flag for me, right? Like I didn't get that kind of buzz in the back of my head that now I absolutely would, now that I have a trained eye. And I think it does go back to that initial answer about kind of our cultural attitudes towards, children, and another layer on that, disabled children, that it didn't kind of red flag for me that I was, forcibly like manipulating someone's hands while they resisted me. That is not okay. I think I don't even really like to describe it, even though that hasn't happened in years and years. And yeah, my practice is ever evolving. There are things that I did 10 years ago that I wouldn't do now. And there are things that I did 2 years ago that I wouldn't do now. And I hope that in another 2 years, as part of my commitment to lifelong learning, there are things that I'm doing now that as my practice evolves, I will abandon, because that's what it is to have an ever evolving practice.
Yeah, I totally understand and agree with that. I mean, the whole point here of teaching, whether it's a scientific approach or not, is that you want to keep getting better. And I think that whether we're talking about teaching or athletics or anything in your life that you want to be as good as you can at, you're going to look back at yourself 2 years earlier and 5 years earlier and 10 years earlier and go, wow, I really wasn't that good then. And that's the whole point. And I think we want to all make sure that we're continuing to get better and better and better, and not just allowing ourselves to sit back on the status quo and say, look, I've helped a lot of kids, so if it worked then, it's working now. And I think that having someone like you and Megan and a bunch of others in the field who are really sharing that information and pushing others, I think is really helpful. And one of the reasons I wanted you on the show today. So as you know, the topic of our show today is about learner assent. I talked a bit up front about what assent is and why I think it's important in ABA. In fact, learner assent was one of the main reasons that I developed the 7 steps to begin with. There just wasn't enough opportunity for kids to choose participation in ABA at the time, and too much captured learning was going on. I know you as a clinician who is very forward thinking and spends a lot of your time training others on the importance of assent. Can you explain to our viewers and listeners how you define assent and why you feel it's so important?
Yeah, of course. So assent is a lot like consent, but more subtle. So consent is really a legal term. It refers to things like informed consent, written consent, that kind of thing, where you are expressly, either vocally or in writing, saying, I agree to this thing. Assent is much, much more subtle, but has the same kind of undercurrent. So when we are looking for learner assent, Greg Hanley refers to this as being happy, relaxed, and engaged. We are looking for body posture. We are looking for rate of responding. Steve Ward refers to that as STEAM. So we're looking for happy, relaxed engagement. We're looking for STEAM, right? We're looking for that kind of level of active engagement. That's when you have a learner who is assenting to instruction. When assent has been withdrawn, you can expect to see a low rate of engagement. You can expect to see body posture turning away or being very still. You can expect to see, more outward, clear signs of assent withdrawal, like the tantrums or flopping or that kind of thing, more obvious stuff. So that's kind of what we're talking about. That's the framework that we're thinking about when we're talking about assent-based instruction.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. I think it's much better than the one I gave at the front end of this podcast. So I am curious, since this podcast is called Just 7 Steps, when did you first learn about the 7 steps to instructional motivation? And if it did, how did it affect your approach in the early days?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I worked for navigation early in my career, and obviously Megan is the co-author on 7 Steps. I actually did have a position at a company a year prior to working with navigation, and so I got to see this real contrast between, I think, old school ABA maybe, or unfortunate ABA. I
tend to call it traditional ABA.
Sure.
Just as the nicest term I can think of for the early versions of what we've been trying to do. But go ahead.
Yeah, but beyond that, traditional, under-supported, under overseen ABA, which I think is an absolute plague on our field, but it's also maybe a separate conversation. And then, I honestly, what happened was I pestered Megan every couple of weeks for a few months until she agreed to bring me on at navigation. And it really, that move was really transformative in terms of how I thought about behavior principles. If you are going to go to the trouble of intimately understanding the science of learning, your application of that should be more sophisticated than you do this and I give you a Skittle. That you don't need to understand scientific principles to hand someone a Skittle after they do a completely unrelated task. So the 7 steps were really influential in all of our programming. We, at the time, it was a different moment in ABA, and at the time, we also didn't have the benefit of having frequent and in-depth conversations about things like assent and degrees of freedom and, enhanced choice and those kind of related conversations. So I would say that the 7 steps are still very integral to my practice, and all of my programming is influenced by that. And it's a reinterpretation for me.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you. I think there's a lot of things that I did, even in the early days of the 7 steps, that I'm absolutely not doing now. And I'm teaching differently. And yeah, the idea that the 7 steps was developed to move us forward from a completely different level of captive learning to a focus on motivated learning and a way to approach maintaining cooperation without physical blocking or escape extinction. At that point, it was quite forward thinking. But as anything, as time moves on, you have to progress with it. And
yeah, that's
great.
amazing. And you know what, Robert? Another really influential piece, and I can't remember if this is from the 7 steps or from the motivation and reinforcement book, but the teaching arc, it has been really influential. So for those, well, it's your idea. I'll let you explain to the listeners what the teaching arc is.
Well, I'm going to have to do a whole nother podcast on the teaching arc, and maybe you've just invited yourself back as a guest on that show. Okay. But yeah, I don't think too much about it because it's always been kind of something I throw in as an advanced lesson along with the advanced stuff for the 7 steps. But yeah, the teaching arc is was a pretty exciting realization at some point. And so, yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, but let's save that. Let's maybe have you back at some point and when I'm ready to talk about the teaching arc, and we'll do an episode on that. Sound good?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome. So like I was saying, I know that I didn't necessarily mention this, but I have been working on updating the 7 steps because they haven't changed in their written form in at least 10 years. And it is definitely time for an update. And I want you to know that I've been putting a ton of time and thought and effort into making sure that the language of the 7 steps is keeping up with the changing understandings we have as a field. And it's time for a change in the tone and wording of the actual steps to help reflect that. So I'm in the process of writing the 2nd edition of the book I have here with Megan Miller, and thought that this would be a perfect time to unveil where I'm at currently with the language for step 7. Love to hear your thoughts.
I'm ready.
My new idea for step 7. Step 7, troubleshooting the first 6 steps. Show your child that not following your most important instructions will not usually result in the same levels of reinforcement. All non-participation will be analyzed and problem solved, but it will also be respected.
I like it.
That's where I'm at right now. And what is interesting now about the way that I teach the 7 steps is that it's no longer a hard and fast rule to use extinction. In fact, step 7 is now considered a troubleshooting step to help you consider all of your options of ways to respond when the first 6 steps have not resulted in the ascent that you were hoping for. So yeah, that's where we're at right now. What do you think?
I do. I like that conceptualization. I think, it's a lot of words. It's a lot of thoughts to pack into one step. So
think of how complicated step 7 is getting now, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All the things that you have to do with step 7 to be able to use it well and not just blanket it over a child. It really is about analyzing the antecedents and looking back over your first 6 steps and seeing if you gave your instructions the right way at the right time with enough motivation. Was there outside motivators? Does this child have a past history with this sort of instruction and all of that, on top of then determining what is your best path forward in the moment, whether moving on or some form of extinction, or at least just a lessening of the amount of available reinforcement might be an option for you, and then making those decisions and going from there. So I really do want to look at step 7 more as troubleshooting than a hard and fast rule. When you don't get this, you do this. And getting away even more so from that traditional type of language.